Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ben. Today I want to talk to you guys about a recent video I saw on a channel by a guy named Matt Ferell. I think his channel is called Undecided. And he does a lot of content about sustainable technology, electric cars, and he's talked a bit about energy efficiency in building. And recently he had a video about prefab housing. The title of the video is something like, is it the future of net zero building, and is it the answer to all of our housing problem, et cetera, which is typically, kind of the theme of a lot of these videos. I wanted to kind of do a little response video, talk about some of the misconceptions that come a lot with, the idea of prefab housing, especially in this sort of sustainable construction, energy efficient world. One of the first things he talks about in his video is global emissions related to construction materials, how much CO2 is created by the production of construction materials. And the idea that, obviously alluding to the fact that prefab would be able to limit some of this, whereas in fact, it doesn't at all. The same amount of timber used in a normal house is going to be used in a prefab house. Oftentimes, you have to use more actually because of the transport process, and whether or not it's modular or panelized, you're going to need more timber in order to produce the same amount of sort of wall and roof material because of that transport and assembly process. So that's one of the misconceptions. It's not any more sustainable from the view of CO2 emissions as site-built homes. So another common misunderstanding or another commonly held belief is that prefab and modular is less expensive than site-built homes. And this is just flat out not true. The most I've seen actually been able to be claimed is that it is cost comparable, or it is on parity with a site-built home, but that it offers speed of construction benefits, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is still even a questionable claim. But in a lot of cases with these more highly energy efficient homes, passive house, prefab, or along those lines, the sort of elevated efficiency prefab options, they can actually be more than a site-built house with the same exact materials. And the reason for that is when you have a construction site, you already have essentially a factory to build your house, right? It might be outdoors, but you have the space. It's built in, it's there. So when you're building your walls, as soon as you tilt it up and put it in place, that's in place. You don't have to move it anywhere. You don't have to connect it to other walls other than what's typically required on site. With a prefab house, obviously, you're gonna have your construction site, and then they're gonna have to have another place where they build these walls. The infrastructure in place to staff the factory, to staff that whole operation, to have all the vehicles and everything you need, the real estate required, that is expensive. That is not cheap, especially in the US, in North America in general. In the Northeast, which is kind of like a mid-range construction cost region in the US. It's not the highest would be the West Coast. But in our region here, it's really not cost competitive to have all that extra infrastructure without the type of volume that you would need to actually make it more cost effective. So almost every time that I've seen small to medium size custom homes priced out with the exact same materials versus a prefab and a site built, it's always the site built that is less expensive. With prefab houses, you need a general contractor who's not actually part of that prefab company to deal with everything on site, right? That prefab product still requires either, assembly on site, or at least if it's a modular, you're gonna need to finish it out on site. So with these prefab panel companies, there's a ton of work that has to go on site, including just putting the panels up. Whether you're hiring a different sub crew or you're doing it yourself as a GC, or the panelized company is coming to do it, there's some overlapping labor involved with doing that, because typically any GC is gonna have their carpentry, their rough carpentry crew, their framers who they can call on to do work, and they're probably gonna be involved in setting the panels. Well, that's basically time that they could have spent putting the walls up themselves, framing the walls up themselves. So there's this extra labor cost in a sense, because you're paying people in the factory to put it together, and you're paying people on site to put it up. And you also just have the coordination that's involved as a GC. And that's kind of one of the main other issues that people don't realize, is that if you're a GC and you have your method of construction, you have your guys, you have your carpenters, you have your framers, you have your roofers, suddenly you have this whole new system that you have to incorporate in your way of building. Not only does it take away from the work that you usually give to your subs, right? They depend on that. And suddenly now it's being outsourced to a factory. You have to figure out all these different details, how it relates to the rest of the project that's you still have to do. The overhead that's involved in all of that sort of figuring out is not really worth it for a GC. And so they're gonna overcharge, because all these efficiencies that you expect to get, in fact, cause a lot of headaches and a lot of unknowns, right? Because these are all relatively new, smaller companies that don't have a ton of experienced builders who they work with. It's very hard to find a situation where a site-built, highly energy efficient, passive style house is gonna be cheaper when it's done as a prefab. So there are also a couple of benefits of prefab that people often mention, which, while being true, also have caveats. For example, sort of a benefit that's typically mentioned is the reduction of waste in these factory-built homes. And while that can be true, waste on a construction site is never sort of a deal breaker for construction, right? And it's never gonna be a huge number that you actually see or actually feel as a consumer. You're talking less than 1% of the total budget. For example, wood waste can be easily reused. I mean, we keep a scrap pile here that we're constantly going to and finding scrap that we need, because you always need scrap wood for various things. You can save it for the future. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. I mean, it's really not even considered waste until you throw it away. And obviously there is waste on a construction site, but there's no saying that that waste doesn't just happen in the factory and they toss it out in the factory and you just never see it. So this sort of the waste argument as far as a cost measure just doesn't really, pan out. Another sort of purported benefit of prefab that I always hear is the sort of speed to finish. Technically, this is definitely true. So while you're building the foundation on site, you can be building the walls in the factory, so that as soon as you're ready on site, they bring the panels, they pop them on. It's much faster, supposedly, or they bring the whole module, pop it on. The issue in reality is that because they're building them off site, there's so many steps in the design process that need to be finalized in such a way before you start building that it takes much longer, because you can't figure it out on site. It has to be every detail, every corner, every measurement has to be essentially perfect, or the tolerances are a lot tighter before you start the building process. So sometimes that can delay your project by a month, 2 months. You got to go through the architect, to the prefab manufacturer, to the engineer, to the GC, in a circle back to the client. That coordination sometimes can eat up all your supposed time savings, that you were gonna get by going prefab. There is some benefit to less time on site. Like when you're doing it in design, you're not paying for a porta potty, you're not paying for a container or a dumpster. But those aren't huge costs either. It doesn't necessarily bring as much benefit as purported. 30 to 50% faster. Maybe, but there's still all these other factors that you have to look at and the total project time. And so another misconception that I see is the claim that somehow prefab is more energy efficient than a stick-built home, which is totally not true. You can build homes just as energy efficient on site or more energy efficient. That all has to do with the amount of insulation, the type of detailing you do, the thermal bridging, the windows, all these different things that are the same process, whether or not you're doing it in a factory or on site. Now, there are, of course, the prefab companies that are sort of making a name for themselves are focused on high performance building. And that's great. I have nothing against that. It's just, you can build a site-built house just as efficient, not have to have a factory that you have to pay for and pay all the employees and all the trucks and everything, cranes and everything that you need to pay for. That's a big misconception, which I don't understand how that gets propagated. But just to put that out there, it's no different. After kind of ragging on prefab, you might kind of wonder, like, well, then what is the answer to net zero, affordable net zero, or widely adoptable net zero building? And it's just not as simple as just saying prefab. But there isn't a silver bullet. That's what I'm trying to say. especially with panelized, which most of the passive house level companies are doing, because doing huge modules, just a lot more challenging on the shipping side than if you do panelized. But when you get panelized walls, all you're getting is framing, insulation, water and air resistant barriers, and maybe windows. And then roof panels, if you're doing roof panels, the same thing. That's really not a huge chunk of the project. It's just not really a compelling case. In future videos, we're gonna talk more about the benefits of mantle and our system and how that can save you money and hopefully, bring net zero to mass adoption. But I also totally feel the pain of Matt Ferell, who said he is looking to build a net zero home in the Northeast. It's very challenging to find a product or a builder or a system, that can be easily implemented in a wide area. If you're just a small family or you're just a dude and you're thinking, all right, I really want to build a cool cabin in the woods. Where do you start? Who do you talk to? Do you just start calling random builders that you search for on Google? It's very challenging. Where do you get the design? All these things. So I totally feel for him, and happy to connect sometime if you're watching this, Matt. And I can explain to you our process and how that's different. Maybe we can help you along the way. I hope you enjoyed the information in this video. If you did, please subscribe, like, notifications, all that good stuff, and I'll catch you next time.